Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our fifth Botanical Society Crew and SANBI webinar. This one is, like all of them, going to be amazing. It's that time of the year, and we're also entering vaccination season with COVID. It's really topical for us to start having the conversation around medicinal plants. And the key is that it's not an easy conversation. It's really, really complex. And we just want to, through the four speakers invited, give you some idea of how complex it actually is. But before that, for those of you who are new to the webinars, your opportunity to interact with the webinar is in the chat informally. So if you just want to say hi and say where you're from and all the rest of it, that's cool. And if you have questions that you'd like to be answered by the speakers, then please use the Q&A function. And then we'll work from there. They are recorded and will be available on our BotSoc YouTube channel afterwards for dissemination if you wanted to talk to more people and show them about it. But also, I'm Rupert Koopman, and I'm the conservation manager at the Botanical Society. And just very thankful that you could all join us this evening. Medicinal plants is something that's near to our hearts. Between 80 and 70% of South Africans use medicinal plants. I've got some buchu here that I got on the weekend from a Rasta. And you know, we just need to get to grips with it and realize that it's not just as easy as saying there are some people using plants that shouldn't be and so forth. It's a lot more complex than that. And at this point, I'm actually going to introduce our first speaker. And it really is great to be joined by such a distinguished person. And it's Prof. Neil Crouch from SANBI. And I'm reading from his bio. Neil has worked for nearly 3 decades as an ethnobotanist and economic botanist with extensive experience in the field of medicinal plant conservation. In the process, he has linked SANBI with various tertiary institutions, SOEs, and traditional health practitioners in natural products, ethnopharmacological, cultural, horticultural, bioprospecting, and cataloging activities. And obviously, from a BotSoc point of view, in 2018, he was the recipient of the Marloth Medal, which is awarded to people who are either professional or amateur botanists who have produced significant literature of a popular nature to stimulate public interest in South Africa's indigenous flora. So thanks, Neil, for joining us. And we really look forward to hearing what you've got to say and just laying the table for the rest of the speakers.
Thank you very much, Rupert, and good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thanks very much for the introduction. As Rupert's noted, I'll be sort of laying some of the groundwork, speaking particularly to the issue of sustainable supply of South African medicinal plants, asking the question, why bother? Is there actually a need to concern ourselves with this? As Richard has pointed out, I've been in the whole realm, so I'm trying to get this to move on. Yeah, the whole realm of bioprospecting and ethnobotany, medicinal plant conservation for about 3 decades. And during that period, I've seen that the issue of sustainable supply of material resources to support the whole African traditional medicine system has really been somebody else's problem. Nobody seems to have identified themselves as a champion here. The very transsectoral nature of ethnomedicine has led to it ultimately being somebody else's problem. No one wants to look at it squarely, identify it, and run with it. In consequence, we have a pretty poor strategy to date, certainly no plan to address the supply issue at a national level. As I say, the transsectoral character, the transdisciplinary character would involve even more sectors than we're seeing here. It would involve also the health, the science, the trade and industry sector. Would necessarily, within that health sector, involve the traditional health practitioners as well. But that hasn't happened to date. When we talk traditional medicine, we can look at it from a couple of key perspectives. The first, of course, would be of perhaps greatest interest to those within the Botanical Society, and that's the plant aspect, the biodiversity aspect. So just a few facts and figures here. Within our flora of some 20,500 species, we find about 10% of those are ethnomedicinal. And of those, about a third are in trade, informal trade, that's within muti markets and within muti shop trade. But just those 650 odd species leads to the trade annually of about 40,000 tons, an enormous amount of material, raw material, every year traded of those particular species. In part consequence of that trade, and I stress that it's just in part consequence, we see 82 species of medicinal plant now listed as threatened with extinction. That's using the IUCN criteria. 56 of these, that's a majority of those threatened species, are known from trade, with trade identified as a key driver of the whole process of leading to extinction. Too much demand, unsustainable sourcing is leading to trouble for some of these species. Additionally, about 100 species are of conservation concern. They're near threatened, they're naturally rare, or they're data deficient. We simply don't have enough information about what's happening in the wild to be able to determine whether they are in fact threatened with extinction. So looking at that from a sort of academic listing perspective, we've got this bar chart, or rather this pie chart, showing those 2,000 odd species, where you can see that most are not threatened with extinction. About 82 are. But I think what's important to note is that those species that are threatened or of conservation concern are in high demand. All right. And they're in high demand because they're very useful and very valuable medicinal plants. They're also the same species that would feed into a formal bioprospecting process that would lead to new products, new job creation, new opportunities for livelihoods for people. So we can't afford to lose them. That's one of the reasons we should bother conserving them. That's just looking forward. But looking at what's actually there at the moment, in terms of the people side of the equation, we find that as Rupert has pointed out, some 70% of all South Africans are making some use. They're relying to some degree on the African traditional medicine system. Okay, and that always incorporates indigenous species, or in some cases, some exotic species that are used locally. But the bottom line is that's a lot of people. That's a lot of benefits for a lot of people. 42 odd million people would be represented by that 70%, which estimated by Mandra in 1998 was about 1/3 of all healthcare provision in South Africa, supplied by the African traditional medicine system. So these few 650 plants, particularly in trade, plus the others which are known to be utilized, are supporting a fantastic service to the South African community. Added to which, we're seeing about 200,000 traditional healers at least, or healthcare practitioners, THPs, who are at least in partial employment through their engagement with ATM, a further 93,000 harvesters and traders, which all adds up to a lot of livelihoods and a substantial contribution to the rural economy. But perhaps most surprisingly, as has been revealed by the most recent National Biodiversity Assessment, we're looking at a value of ATM in South Africa of about 18 billion annually. Most of that not even within view of the taxon at the moment. So it is of importance that these plants are conserved. The person on the street's life will be affected, their quality of life and so on. Besides which, we have a constitution where, as much as we have a right to access these resources to support justifiable economic and social livelihoods, we also have a responsibility to ensure that we use them responsibly and sustainably so that others within our generation and in the generations that follow also have equal access to those resources. Besides which, we need to constitutionally avoid ecological degradation and to promote conservation. So those are other good reasons why we should be bothered. I'm looking at a slightly different aspect here. I'm looking at a healer who in 1996 went with me to Ngoya Forest. This is Baba and Tetwa. He harvested bark from the scalopia and he rubbed some soil into the base of the tree. And he took what he needed for his patient at that time and what he saw would be needed in the foreseeable future. I followed that tree over the course of 13 years and I witnessed quite remarkable healing, such that 13 years later, it was quite difficult to discern where that tree had ever been affected by man. And I would argue that was sustainable harvesting. But in this day and age, it's very difficult to still utilize species at that level because, of course, we have an ever-expanding population. And at the same time, by the day, we have fewer resources available to service the needs of that population. And so with 40,000 tons moving through the muti market, this is just one mat of hundreds that will be out every day. You can imagine that there are great concerns about sustainability. When harvesters go out of the field, they often will take what they can access rather than what is sustainable because they are an impoverished community. They have large families to feed and they will unsustainably access material. Example by this ringbark tree on the left here, which I think was a Phaidobia. The market receives the material, it feeds in and supports 42 million people on an annual basis. The concerns about sustainability are not new. You know, back in 1946, that's 75 years ago, Jacob Gerstner wrote in the SA Forestry Journal of his concerns about forest species that he saw in trade. And he pointed out, quite rightly, that the policy of the day to not touch the forest, to leave them alone, hands-off policy, wasn't working then. 75 years later, it is not working now. And he pointed out it's just merely protracting and not preventing the inevitable. That's to say the lamentable process of extinction. And at the same time as expressing his concern, he also looked at an intervention, one possible part of the solution, and that was state cultivation of material to substitute for wild harvested material. But 75 years later, we're still talking the same story because we still don't have a champion. We still don't have a state entity or an NGO or a parastatal that has said, this is part of our mandate, we're going to drive this. But is it harvesters alone who are responsible for the demise of medicinal plants? And the answer is a quite clear no. And I'm going to use this as one select example to show you why. This traditional healer near Durban is presenting a codex of Dioscorea sylvatica, which back in the 1950s into the early 1960s was systematically extracted from the forests in what today is KwaZulu-Natal and Mpumalanga to supply to Boots, the chemist in the United Kingdom, because they were producing cortisone. And in consequence, a large amount of material moved out. This is one pile estimated to be about 26 tons of weight, all right? And over that 13-year period, about 175 such piles of just that species were taken out for Boots, the chemist in the UK. All right, small surprise that today that species is threatened with extinction and is categorized as vulnerable. Second point to make, and probably even more pertinent, because the selective extraction of materials from the environment doesn't happen often on a pharmaceutical basis. Much more prevalent is the actual loss of habitat within which these medicinal plants exist. And looking at the National Biodiversity Assessment of 2018, we find this map where the darker, more maroon colors indicate those areas which are being subjected to the greatest rate of habitat loss, up to 1.5% per annum in South Africa. You can see primarily the Southwestern Cape, Eastern Seaboard of KwaZulu-Natal, up into Gauteng, and some of the hinterland regions there. 1.5%, you may say, is not too substantial, but at the end of the day, when that's cumulatively considered, you'll find a map like this, published by Jewett and co-workers in 2015, where they could show that in KwaZulu-Natal, as indicated by a darkening of the map from left to right, that between 2005 and 2011, 7.6% of natural habitat was transformed in KwaZulu-Natal, just in a 6-year period. My question to you would be, what happened to the medicinal plants within that environment in the course of its transformation? How much was lost? What is the impact on African traditional medicine and on healing provision? That's in the present and going forward into the future. Is that sustainable? Arguably not. Again, going back to the NBA of 2018, you can find out what the key pressures are in biodiversity within the environment. It's quite clear on the left-hand side within the terrestrial realm that it is agriculture and urbanization that are primarily leading to our habitat loss and the loss of medicinal plants within that. But there are other drivers as well: climate change, mining activities, transportation and service corridors, roads, etc. But if you look at the second row, biological resource use, you get to see what use impacts are in relative context to the other impacts within the terrestrial realm. Obviously, with medicinal plants, you're looking at a much more selective extraction from the landscape. So this picture wouldn't be true for a medicinal plant scenario, but it gives you an idea that the selective extraction of medicinal plants by muti harvesters is not the key driver of medicinal plant loss in South Africa. So the next time you see development happening, for example, here at Katsi Dam site in Lesotho back in the mid-90s, think how many thousands of tons of medicinal plants were lost. Next time you see a road or a construction site, how much is going under tar and concrete that we're losing? And in the process, eroding our cultural heritage, our healing traditions, our healing opportunities. So what's been done? Well, there's been very limited work progress in respect of a strategy and an action plan for addressing sustainable supply of medicinal resources to support the African traditional medicine sector. Some loose ends have been tied up within the global strategy for plant conservation. You can read that on an online version. You can also pick up on progress at a global level in relation to the GSPC. But at the end of the day, we've got a long way to go. We have no simple solutions to the crisis, this huge challenge that we have to sustainably supply. There are no simple solutions, but what solutions do arise will be as a result of improved collaboration, cooperation, and consultation, including with the traditional healer communities. I list some of the possible elements that could feed into a strategy that could be picked up and developed by the broader community, in which I see BotSoc also playing a potentially large role. What those elements are would be up for negotiation and discussion. I list them here without discussing them, given our time considerations, and in view of the fact that some of my colleagues who will be speaking shortly after me will be addressing some of these exact issues. So I'll leave them to speak to aspects relating to this very precious resource, medicinal plants. Thank you. And back to you, Rupert. Thanks.
Wow, Neil. That was spectacular as a groundwork. I think that question, and Neil and I have had the privilege of being in meetings before, that question of the damage that has been done preliminarily needs to be always brought into context. And every time we see development, that it comes at that consequence of us losing options of using plants and medicinal plants and livelihoods going forward. So, wow. I want to just quickly share some plants because Nolwazi's presentation is next, but we had to record her, and we realized that some of these plants that we mentioned were not shown. So just so that people know, sorry. So it's Isibacha, Ispeteto, wild ginger, Matitibala, Haworthia, the elephant's foot that Inyatelo Ndlovu that Neil just mentioned, Katazo, and Gibicilla. So these are the plants that will be mentioned in the next presentation. Madeleine, you can start queuing up the video. I just want to read out Nolwazi's bio. So Nolwazi Mbongwa is a second-year PhD candidate at the Institute of Communities and Wildlife at UCT, investigating the cultural value and sustainability of wildlife use amongst Muti traders and traditional healers in South Africa. Nolwazi is also a trained Sangoma, traditional healer, and her love for the environment stems from a rural background where nature is not only loved for its aesthetic value, but also holds cultural significance for its inhabitants. And there will be a little bit of background noise with the recording because she was traveling, and so if you hear a bit of engine noise and the odd cup clinking, it's all part of the ambiance. So thank you very much, Madeleine. Hit it.
Evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nolwazi Mbongwa, and I'm currently doing this presentation from George, Western Cape. And I'll be talking about the traditional healers' insight for the development of biodiversity management plans for 6 threatened medicinal plant species in eThekwini district, Mpumalanga. The use and trade of medicinal plants are embedded in African culture. Therefore, despite access to Western medicine, about 72% of South Africans still use medicinal plants, and this is threatening their survival in the wild. Unsustainable harvesting and overexploitation of wild medicinal plants are some of the activities that are causing the decline in wild medicinal plants. This is just an illustration of a medicinal plant that has been debugged in the wild. With decline of medicinal plants in the wild, traditional healers and other resource users are forced to buy materials from Muti markets. This is an illustration of how Muti is actually packaged and also stored inside a Muti market. The aim of this project, therefore, is to engage with traditional healers and Muti gatherers to develop a plan for how we can manage medicinal plants in the eThekwini district to ensure that there's a sustainable use of medicinal plants. The objectives are as follows: to investigate the demand and supply of the medicinal plants, what methods are used and or are seen as important for plant conservation. This study was a 2-part study in which the first part of the study was done in 2016, whereby there was an initial selection of the species that were going to be part of the biodiversity management plan. A priority scoring system was used to select threatened species based on these categories: conservation status, population trend, distribution pattern, popularity demand, presence in protected areas, ease of propagation, duration to harvesting, survival to harvesting. And according to the priority scores in ascending order, these are the species that were chosen: Siphonecalis ethiopicus, Boila volubis, Alipida cordifolia, Wabega salutaris, Howethiopsis limofolia, and Dioscorea sylvatica. The study took place at various urban and rural areas in eThekwini district municipality. And then we went to the local municipalities, Bushbuck Ridge. We went to Tabachwewu local municipality, City of Mbombela, and lastly, we went to Nkomazi local municipality, whereby we conducted semi-structured interviews comprising of 137 traditional healers and 3 Muti gatherers with regard to what can be done to conserve medicinal plants. I'll now go to the results and discussion. This first graph is showing us the perceptions of decline in availability of wild populations of the 6 species in the eThekwini district. So we actually asked the traditional healers that from a time scale from 15, 10, 5 to 2 years, when last have they actually observed the decline in these 6 species? And what we saw is that Alipida cordifolia was the only species to have mentioned to be last declining in the past 5 years. And then Dioscorea, Boira volubis, Howethiopsis limofolia, and Siphonecalis ethiopicus, and Wabega salutaris were last seen in the last 10 years. And Howethiopsis limofolia was last seen in the past 5 years. So this is just showing us that the majority of the species have last been observed in the past 5 years to 10 years, and some 10. And this is just showing that there is a dire need for conservation in the district because there is a huge a large number of medicinal users that have observed a decline in the species. And just to also note that Dioscorea has been observed to be declining in the past 15 years. And this has also been an impact because of the commercial trade that was impacted by international harvesters and investors. This table is showing us the harvest areas that were identified by the traditional health practitioners that are working in the Ehlanzeni district to be the areas in which they can still find the 6 medicinal plants. And the one local municipality that was chosen the most, or rather mentioned the most, was Tabachwe municipality. Tabachwe local municipality is now seen as the hotspot for the 6 threatened medicinal plant species. And this is just showing that this particular local municipality needs an intervention in terms of conservation and protection of these species. However, it will be a wise move for us to include traditional healers and gatherers in that intervention and implementation of whatever conservation program we will come with in order to be able to protect these species. This graph, we were actually asking the traditional healers and the gatherers, how do they actually get these medicinal plants? So we wanted to know if they still collect, or do they just buy only, or do they still do both? So when we asked them if they collect and if they travel far for this, all the municipalities except for Nkomazi said that they do collect, and they actually do travel far in order for them to get these medicinal plants. And then when I wanted to know that when they do go to collect, is it easy for them when they get in the wild and collect? Except for Bushbuck Ridge and Tabachu, they said it's not easy for them to collect. In Bombela and in Nkomazi, they said it's easy to collect. But with Nkomazi, the exception was their collection was kind of different, because their collection was kind of like buying, because they were getting it from someone else. So they're not necessarily collecting for themselves in the wild. And so when we wanted to know that, do they buy? So a majority in all the 4 local municipalities, they mentioned that they actually do buy these medicinal plants. And then when we asked them, is it easy to buy? All the municipalities, except for Bushbuck Ridge, mentioned that it is easy to access this particular medicinal plants. So now the question was, if you are buying, where are you buying from? And so the majority of all the 4 study sites mentioned that they make use of stalls that are erected during pension days. So it was 35 in Bombela, 77 in Bushbuck Ridge, 7 in Tabachwe, and 10 in Nkomazi mentioned that they make use of pension days. However, it is interesting to note that there are some traditional healers that are actually also making use of Faraday. Faraday is actually 300 to 400 kilometers away from Ehlanzeni district municipality. So this is just showing us that most of the traditional leaders are traveling a very long distance in order for them to be able to get these medicinal plants. 7 in Bombela, 8 in Bushbuck Ridge, 3 in Tabachwe, and 9 in Nkomazi. So what we wanted to know also was, if ever we are to conserve these medicinal plants, which way can we use, or rather can we implement in order to be able to conserve them? But we also wanted to know if it was going to be possible that they can cultivate for themselves, or if they've already been cultivated. So the one thing that we asked them is, have they used cultivated medicinal plants before? And the majority in all the 3 local municipalities, except for Mbembela, mentioned that they've used cultivated medicinal plants before. And also we had asked them if they've ever noticed any problems with cultivated medicinal plants. And by problems, we're mentioning that in terms of, is there a spiritual limitation or a mechanical limitation? So in terms of spiritual limitation, there are certain medicinal plants that are not allowed to be cultivated because of spiritual reasons. And also there are those that are not allowed to be cultivated because of it doesn't grow near homesteads. So the one spiritual limitation that they mentioned was that if you use fertilizers, fertilizers end up causing the plants to lack potency. So it means that they are not as potent as the wild medicinal plant. And also there's certain plants that ancestors do not allow for those particular plants to be cultivated near a homestead. And how to counteract that, they mentioned that we can use natural manure instead of artificial fertilizers. And also on the other hand, we can be able to do rituals to appease the ancestors in order to allow us to be able to cultivate that particular medicinal plant. And when we ask them, do they see cultivation as a solution to conservation, or as a solution rather to the problem, and to be able to conserve? The majority in all the 4 local municipalities said yes, they do observe cultivation as a solution. However, there was a split between some saying home gardens are better option and some were saying nurseries would be a better option. So we still have that thing of trying to decide which option will be more viable for the traditional healers. In the following table, we just ask them if they are already cultivating, which medicinal species are they already cultivating? So the ones that are highlighted in bold are the ones that were mentioned more than once. What is interesting here for us to note is that 4 out of the 6 medicinal species that were selected for the BMP actually are already being cultivated by the traditional healers. Your Alipida cordifolia, Wabegia salutaris, Siphonocallis ethiopicus, and Hauthiopsis limofolia are part of the 4 that are already being cultivated. Cultivation is seen as the appropriate initiative to mitigate the declines of wild medicinal plants, but there is differences in opinion as to whether home gardens or nurseries would be more practical. There are also socio-cultural factors that needs to be considered when cultivating and also take into consideration the differences in local traditions. Co-development of management plans that balance conservation with sustainable rural livelihoods and retain indigenous knowledge are necessary prerequisites for an effective BMP, especially for species that are beneficial to humanity. Siyathokoza. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nolwazi. So I had the benefit of seeing that talk, or else I would have been just as flabbergasted as the previous one. It really lays out what we're dealing with pretty well. At this moment in time, just to remind you, if you're not yet following the Botanical Society on our various social media platforms, that now would be a good time, or just after the meeting, so you can keep up to date with the news. There's regular blogs on various topics. Not so active on Twitter, but definitely Instagram. And we want to be profiling a lot more of the work of our branches. And speaking of branches, the discussion around medicinal plants and conservation projects is something that we are taking forward. And yeah, watch the space for what we can achieve. I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, Louise Swemmer. And we're taking note of your points in the Q&A, and we'll get to them. And if you don't get to them, please come to the Zoom after party. So Dr. Louise Swemmer coordinates social science research for the Savannah and Grassland Research Node in SANBI, based from Hoedspruit up in Limpopo. Louise's main interests are in people-nature relationships and how these contribute towards or degrade human well-being and protected area sustainability. Louise works with a range of projects on natural resource use, human well-being, and human-wildlife conflict. So thanks, Louise, for joining us this evening, and looking forward to hearing about some of the solutions that you've been involved with.
Thanks, Rupert. Thanks very much, and good evening to everybody. It's really nice to be here tonight and to be able to share some of the experiences that we've had in the medicinal plant realm over the last sort of 10 years or so. So what I would like to do is, before I start, well, let's first see if I can actually change my slide. Okay, Rupert, will you just confirm that you can see my opening slide?
Yeah, see it.
Okay. So before I start, I think the first important thing is that, I'm going to be talking about the Pepperbark project, and this is a project that we started in 2008. But the Kruger Park has actually got a very long history of engaging with traditional healers on the western boundary of the park in a number of different projects and programs, successes and failures over the years. And there's been subsequent programs since the start of the Pepperbark project as well. So I'm going to focus on this project. So we've heard about the Pepperbark tree, Wabergia salutaris. For those that are not familiar with the plant, it's a shrub or a medium-sized tree in most instances. It's a very popular medicinal plant, and it's used to treat ailments of the chest mostly. But it's also used for a number of other things, and for that reason, it's often referred to as the panacea, because it's so successful in terms of its treatments of the body. So it's an expectorant, so it's something similar to what you would get if you took something like mucospec from a normal sort of Western pharmacy. Generally, it's found in many countries in Southern Africa. But in South Africa, we find Pepperbark in Limpopo as well as in Mpumalanga provinces, and we also find it in KwaZulu-Natal. But the point is really that it's endangered, it's on the red list, and it's actually facing quite high risks of extinction in the wild because of its popularity on the traditional medicine market. So the way it's used is that people slice the bark off the main stem or of side stems. It's sold on the markets normally in the form of bundles of bark of various sizes, and it's used in its powdered form. So what does this mean for sandparks? You would have noticed that I work for sandparks as a social scientist. So we've got one of the largest remaining populations of Warburgia in the wild. And in the sort of middle to late 2000s, there was an increase in illegal harvesting of these plants inside the Kruger National Park. And what was significant is that the way in which they were being harvested had changed. So Neil showed some really nice examples earlier. And in my photograph, you can see the stem on the right-hand side was harvested a long time ago. There's very long, thin sort of strips of bark, but that stem is still fine and it's still healthy. On the left-hand side, you see the same sort of, it's actually the same tree, a different stem that's been completely ring-barked, and that's of course got consequences for whatever comes above that section of the stem. Lots of examples of illegal harvesting within the Kruger population in the mid sort of 2000s, and this of course was a cause of concern. So on the left-hand side, I'm showing a picture of a very tall stem of Warburgia. I say stem because we're not always sure if they're individual plants or not. But you can see that one has been completely killed in terms of its crown because it was ring-barked at the bottom through harvesting. So it's quite a resistant tree in terms of coppicing, so they resprout quite well, especially when they've been damaged from the base, but extensive harvesting does result in death. So the first thing that we did is we employed rangers. We got some funding in 2009 through the Ivory Fund, through the sale of ivory, which was quite significant for us because we were able to use the benefits from a species to be able to save another species. And we employed these rangers whose sole job is to patrol these plants. So it's quite different to protecting rhino, because the trees don't move and we know exactly where they are. So the guys can go out on a daily basis and just really are a deterrent, and the illegal harvesting reduced significantly as a result. So we're quite privileged to be able to say that we've got these guys out in the field. But of course, this is not a sustainable solution. And conservation agencies today, specifically sandparks and Kruger, have got a long way to be able to sort of recover from past injustices and to make biodiversity available to broader society. So we started exploring ways of being able to do this through a number of projects, the Pepperbark being one. So we've kept the armed guards, of course, but our second objective was really about looking at ways that we can promote access to alternative sources of pepperbark tissue. And this would include looking at the use of leaves as opposed to bark, making leaves available locally, and then making saplings available, and then of course looking at ways that we could potentially facilitate access of these sort of sustainably harvested tissues to the commercial market. We've also got an objective of with regards to monitoring our existing populations, both in terms of population ecology, but then also looking at the threats and drivers for the populations, which is quite important. So SAON, some of you may know of SAON, they've been primarily involved from the beginning of the project, looking at the vegetation ecology of Warburgia. There's been a number of other projects that have been involved over time monitoring the populations. We're specifically interested in the reproductive ecology because it seems that the plants in Kruger don't reproduce sexually, so there's not very many viable seeds on the ground. And we thought that might have implications for the sustainability of the populations. What's also interesting about the Kruger ones is that it seems as if they are generally going to be clonal because many of them seem to be joined at the base. So we thought both of these things might mean that we need to understand how these populations are actually persisting. So there's quite a lot of work going on around that. But the work that I've been involved in has mostly been on that second objective with regards to engaging with the user groups. And we started doing this in 2009. So the idea was really to take a bottom-up approach to this project and to understand from people what would be useful and how we can work together to try and conserve some of these plants, specifically the pepperbark tree. So we facilitated a number of different meetings. We brought traditional healers down from as far north as Hamakuya in the far north between Punda and Kafuri. We had healers from the Bushbuck Ridge area as well. And we really just spent a lot of time discussing and looking at different options that we could work together to benefit both people as well as biodiversity. and we met in a number of different areas. But the bottom line is that there was a lot of positive interest. We had very positive feedback, and everyone was really ready to start engaging in this thing. So it meant that we needed to start, and we needed plants. We started working with some community nurseries to see if we could propagate the pepperbark. Everyone had said, no, they were propagated by the 1,000 in the 90s when it was Tree of the Year. So we thought, oh, it's going to be a piece of cake. And it turned out to be quite a challenge. And I think Karin's going to talk a bit more about that later on. While we were waiting for these things to grow, then we decided to make leaves available. So we harvested leaves from, not from the Kruger population specifically, but from ones in nurseries and from trees outside of the park. And then enabled the traditional healers to start experimenting with leaves to see if they were comfortable with that. And then, of course, you know, by 2012, we sort of still didn't have any plants, and it was starting to get a bit dire. So we actually ended up buying in the first batch of 20 trees that actually supplemented our, you know, started off our project. So we found some in a nursery in Komatipoort, and we bought them, and they were like gold, as you can imagine, back then. And then the decisions of who we distributed them to is also not very easy for us to make. But then we ended up doing that, and subsequent to that, there's been an amazing explosion of plants. So this is all thanks to a couple of superheroes, in my opinion. I've got them listed down there, but they certainly experimented and tried and didn't give up. And the reality is that we're sitting now with literally thousands and thousands of pepperbark saplings that have been made available for this program. So very big, huge thanks to them. And often I actually land up in the distribution bottleneck because there's actually so many that we've got available to give away. So of course this enabled me to then expand quite a lot on the engagement with traditional healers, which was really the objective from the very beginning. And we had lots of meetings, discussions all over the place. And this really took the form of workshops in different areas where we discussed things like the availability of species. So how easy was it for people to get hold of certain plants? What plant parts did they find the most useful? Specifically because not that we wanted to try and steal knowledge or anything, but it was really about trying to understand how we could help people in terms of supplying them sustainably through this program. We were also interested in how people perceived the use of nursery propagated plants, and Nolwazi spoken a bit about that as well, because it was, you know, people thought that might be an issue. And then we also discussed just sort of general challenges facing traditional healers in the area, because we acknowledge that they're an important user group. So at the workshops, we do planting demonstrations. It's not always easy to sort of dictate how to plant a tree when you don't know what resources people have available. And in many of these areas, they're very water restricted. So we weren't sure how that was all going to work. So we sort of had to co-develop different ways of planting plants. These are some examples of the wild ginger as well. But that's quite an important part of the workshop, is showing people how to plant, actually learning together with them in their environment. And then once they see, then they go back to their areas. You know, we do a planting demo, and then they're able to go back and plant in their homesteads, and also help other people that they've taken plants for to then plant them as well. So one of the objectives of the workshops is also to develop a sort of an engagement and distribution network. You can imagine in the areas next to Kruger, there's a lot of villages and lots of healers. So we can't engage with everybody one-on-one. But what we do is at the workshops, we select representatives. We don't, the workshop participants do. And then we engage with those individual representatives at a village level for a number of different things for the project. So then the workshops sort of basically end off with tree distributions, which is like the reward at the end of the day. It's so fun. And it's really rewarding to be able to give people something that is so valuable and important, and you know that it's going to make a massive difference to them at the end of the day. At the same time, knowing that you are actually doing something positive towards and for conservation. So literally hundreds and hundreds of these trees go out every year, and people take them home and plant them. And within sort of a year or so, they're able to harvest the leaves pretty well. In cases where the workshop venues are quite far, we help with transport. In other cases, people just walk home. Sometimes people rush home and plant them straight away. But it's a very rewarding process and a very effective process. So generally, the workshops have got around 20 people participating, normally 20 traditional healers plus a few extra people. And they represent between 2 and 12 villages at a time, depending on a number of different factors. So up until before COVID, we had conducted 20 workshops in different areas, ranging right from the Pafuri area right down, for those of you that know the Kruger Park, down to the Crocodile Bridge area. So we've engaged directly through these workshops, which we call primary engagements, with in the region of 400 traditional healers. And they have been since engaged with in the region of about 2,500 traditional healers through the secondary engagement, through the representatives. So it covers an area of more than 100 villages, and we've distributed in the region of 30,000 of these saplings over the last 10 years. So just for those of you that know the area, there's a map of Kruger. We haven't embarked on the east, unfortunately. Lots of different regulations around that, but that certainly is something that we'd like to look into. But every little one of those green dots is a village, and each one of those villages or towns has been given either somewhere in the region of between 30 or 1,000 Walburgias, depending on the number of healers that are in that village. So we have done pretty extensive distribution in the area. Just in terms of the numbers, you can see from the very early days, there's that first little bubble of 20 plants, and you can see how far it's come. A massive sort of effort was made in 2018, but it's pretty much in the region of about 4,000 to 6,000 saplings that are distributed annually from the Skukuza nursery. But I think what's one of the most rewarding parts, what blurry pictures, my apologies, but one of the most rewarding parts of this whole program is actually going back. So it's not just giving the plants, but it's going back, visiting people, talking to people, seeing how the plants are growing, finding out if they are useful, if people are using them, what some of their challenges are. And this is an important part of the project. It's a difficult part of the project as it's expanding over time. We started off with, a handful of villages, a handful of people, and it was easy to go back and talk to them and maintain relationships, but now it's massive. So it's one of the challenges, but hopefully we've got some funding to do a big effort at that for the second half of this year. So lots of interesting ways in which people plant and maintain these different plants. But I think the bottom line is that trees survive, they've survived. It's incredible, especially in certain areas that are suitable habitats. And leaf use is very widespread now, whereas it really wasn't when we started at all. And there's some reasons around that I can chat about if there's time afterwards. We found a very high acceptability of cultivated material, so that would reflect some of the work that Nolwazi's done as well, and reduce the demand significantly for on the local market. So all the people that we engage with do not buy any Walburgia on the local market. So that's pretty exciting for us. And there's even people that are actually sort of dabbling in supplying the commercial market themselves, so people that have been part of the project for a long time. So one of the things we also do is look at other species and the potential for them. We've heard a bit about wild ginger tonight. That's one of the most sought after plants based on our workshops over the last 10 years. And that has also driven us to then engage further with the ARC, who've been incredibly supportive through propagating these wild gingers, which we then do in the same sort of way as we do with the pepperbark. A little bit more tricky with wild ginger, because it's a rhizome. So, whereas pepperbark you can harvest and use the leaves and your tree is still there, the rhizomes actually, once you take a rhizome up, then you can't kind of replant it. So it just requires a different sort of model, as would all the different plant species. But there's nothing's really impossible. So there's ways to work around some of these things. So certainly as we go forward, we're hoping to get some more funding to do this at a much wider scale. One of the other things we're trying to do is to support in terms of permitting and legalizing some of the trade in some of these plants, because many of them are protected and they're top species. There's a lot of permitting regulations around it, and that makes it really difficult for people to actually, firstly, use them and access them, and then also develop value around them, which we feel is important for the sustainability of these plants going forward. So that's through the sort of recent program of the biodiversity management plans through SANBI, and I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about that from Karin as well. But just to sort of end off, I think, not everything's about conservation, and it's these relationships that are so important, and it's through the Pepperbark program that we then engaged with a lot of the healers next to Kruger when COVID arrived and sort of hit the country with such a huge bang, and they were a very vulnerable group and still are, and received very little support. So we were able to capitalize on our relationships and our networks to provide support for them in the context of PPE, as well as information. But one of the sort of interesting lessons that you always learn along the way with these sort of projects is that it's not always about the tangible benefits of what you think it might be. So it's not always about specifically the plant. In this case, it wasn't about the mask. It was actually about the fact that people were remembered at a time when the country was in complete chaos. And that was the most meaningful sort of part of the project for a lot of people that were engaged through it. So some of the take-home messages is that individual incentives for success are quite important, and we think that that is one of the reasons why this seems to be working. It's not like we started a project. You know, once people have the trees, they can do with them as they please. We've found that the co-learning approach has been incredibly useful. It wasn't something that we designed. You know, it took about 6 months for us to engage and chat and discuss and decide how we're going to go forward together with the user groups. These sort of things require champions and they require teamwork. It's not something that anyone can do on their own. But you have to be adaptable and you have to be flexible because you never actually know how things are going to work out. And having funders that are adaptable and flexible and allow you to be able to sort of roll with the punches is incredibly valuable. And that's what we've certainly had over the years through the sponsorship from SAPI. But I think the sort of important point here and linking into some of the previous talks is that it is an ongoing journey. And so that photo on the right-hand side is unfortunately a tree that was harvested in Kruger over the last sort of 2 weeks, I think. So it means that we're not out of the water. So think back on that map that I showed you about all those really literally thousands and thousands of pepperbarks that are out there. But if you drop your guard, you know, it doesn't mean that the protected ones are safe. So, you know, it's an ongoing process. I think it's massively, you know, the risk is far less than it was, but it's not something that we can tick a box and then move on to something else about. Okay, so lots of different people involved in this. I'm not going to start with the names, but lots of different people involved over the years. And I think just to finish off, I think the most important people to acknowledge here are the traditional healers. It's an honor and, you know, working with traditional healers over these years, and just a huge big thank you to them. And I think looking forward to lots of different opportunities that are rolling out now based on the sort of last 10 years that have now become open to us to explore new options of working together. And I think these sort of models where you have both people and biodiversity benefits are what is going to be required for the sustainability of both of us over the, you know, in the coming future when you think that we're in the Anthropocene and running out of space. So that was our project in a nutshell. I hope everyone's still there because that was quite a lot of stuff. I'm going to pass over to Karin, and she's going to tell you more about the nitty-gritty and the research side of things because she's been involved with us for many years.
Thanks, Louise. That's pretty awesome. From the comments, people are quite encouraged. I think it's great to show what's really going on because people tend to get a little bit depressed about these things, and it is what it is.
And fill you in on the latest developments. So thanks for listening.
Thanks, Karin. I just want to give Nolwazi a chance to answer the question. We've been busy answering in the Q&As as well. So Nolwazi, do you want to go for it?
Yes, the one question was about whether I'm taking a wild sourced medicinal plant and replanting it in its habitat.
Oops, we're losing you.
In its habitat, for people to believe that people are believing that if you ever the problem that we are having with it. So already now there is no supply for the traditional leaders to even try and make use of that type of intervention.
Okay. Yeah, so that is definitely the beginning of a conversation rather than the end thereof. Just the way that we've gone over our time. And I want to thank all the speakers for really laying out the complexities that we have here, and all of you for listening for so long. Just to remind people that if you want to continue the conversation, please go on to the next Zoom meeting, which we will be opening shortly. And our next webinar is promoting good land management in a month's time, on Thursday, the 24th of June at the same time, same place. And we look forward to you all joining us there. So also thank you to Madeleine from VetLink for helping out behind the scenes. My team, the Conservation Committee at BotSoc, SANBI and crew, everyone involved with the brainstorming behind these webinars. And again, the speakers for making time. So cheers, everyone. Have a good evening. Be safe, and see you in the next Zoom meeting. I'm going to paste it there again so that you can access it, and we can maybe continue the conversation. And also to Nolwazi, please drive safely.